The stove sat in the corner of the cabin, an odd-looking contraption that drew stares and comments from every trapper who saw it. It was a standard cast-iron box stove, nothing unusual there. But surrounding the stove, packed around it like a cocoon, was a thick layer of mud mixed with moss and grass. The mud coating was 8 inches thick on all sides, making the stove look like a misshapen clay monument. It was ugly, bizarre, and according to every experienced Alaska trapper who saw it, completely stupid. They said the mud would crack and fall off with the first fire. They said it would trap moisture and rust out the stove. They said it would restrict airflow and make the stove smoke. They said it would make the stove heat slower and work worse. They said a lot of things, and none of them were complimentary. The man who built it, a Norwegian trapper named Gunnar Olafsen, just smiled and kept packing more mud. He knew something they didn't, and when the temperature dropped to 62 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, when other trappers were burning through their entire winter wood supply in a desperate fight against the killing cold, Gunnar's mud-packed stove kept his cabin at 58 degrees with a fraction of the fuel everyone else used. Suddenly, the stupid, mud-packed stove didn't seem so stupid anymore. The story begins in the fall of 1912, when Gunnar arrived in the Yukon River Valley to establish his trap line. He was 48 years old, a veteran of the Klondike gold rush who'd switched from prospecting to trapping when the easy gold played out. He'd trapped in northern Norway before immigrating to Alaska, and he'd experienced cold that could kill a man in minutes if he wasn't prepared. The other trappers in the region were a mix of sourdoughs, old-timers who'd been in Alaska for decades, and chichakos, newcomers still learning the hard lessons of the North. Gunnar fell somewhere in between. He'd been in Alaska for 15 years, long enough to be considered experienced, but he was still learning, still adapting, still trying to solve the fundamental problem of interior Alaska, the cold. Interior Alaska cold is different from cold anywhere else in North America. Temperatures of 40 below are common. 50 below happens regularly. 60 below, while rare, occurs every few years during cold snaps when high-pressure systems settle over the region and temperatures plummet. At these temperatures, exposed skin freezes in seconds. Breath freezes in the air, spit freezes before it hits the ground. Metal becomes brittle, rubber shatters, wood splits, and staying warm becomes a full-time, exhausting job. The standard trapper's cabin in 1912 Alaska was a simple log structure, usually 10 by 12 feet or 12 by 14 feet. Logs chinked with moss or mud, a flat roof covered with sod, one small window, a door, and most importantly, a stove. The stove was life. Without heat, a man was dead. Most trappers used sheet metal Yukon stoves, simple boxes made from thin steel. These stoves were cheap, lightweight, and adequate for most conditions. They heated up quickly, which was good, but they also cooled down quickly, which was bad. A sheet metal stove required constant feeding. Let the fire die down and the cabin cooled within minutes. At 40 below, this meant waking every 2 to 3 hours through the night to add wood. At 60 below, it meant essentially not sleeping at all, just dozing between wood additions. Some trappers used cast-iron box stoves. These were heavier and more expensive but held heat somewhat better than sheet metal. A cast-iron stove might let you sleep for 3 to 4 hours between feedings on a normal cold night, but on an extreme cold night, even cast iron wasn't enough. The fuel consumption was staggering. A trapper might burn a full cord of wood in a week during the coldest periods. That meant cutting and hauling a cord of wood every week, in temperatures where simply being outside was dangerous. The labor was exhausting and never-ending. And if you fell behind, if you didn't have enough wood cut and stacked, you could freeze. It had happened. Trappers had been found frozen in their cabins, out of firewood, out of time, out of luck. Gunnar had spent 14 winters in Alaska, and everyone had involved this brutal routine. Cut wood all fall. Burn wood all winter, never enough wood, never warm enough, always exhausted, always one mistake away from freezing. There had to be a better way. In Norway, before immigrating, Gunnar had seen masonry stoves. These were massive structures built from brick or stone, often weighing several tons. They heated slowly but held heat for hours after the fire went out. A single firing could keep a home warm for 12 to 18 hours. But masonry stoves required bricks, mortar, skilled construction, and a foundation that could support tremendous weight. None of these were practical in a remote Alaska trapline cabin, but the principle stuck with Gunnar. Mass stores heat. If he could add mass to a stove, it would hold heat longer. The question was how to add mass without the weight, cost, and complexity of a masonry stove. The answer came to him while he was repairing the chinking on his cabin. He'd mixed up a batch of mud, moss, and dried grass to fill gaps between the logs. The mixture dried hard and held together well. It insulated decently, and it was abundant and free. What if he packed this mud mixture around a stove? Would it add enough thermal mass to make a difference? Would it even survive the heat? Most people would say no. Most people would be wrong. Gunnar ordered a cast-iron box stove from Fairbanks, paying $42 for a good quality unit. The stove arrived by riverboat in August, and Gunnar began his experiment. First, he built a solid platform for the stove. He knew the final assembly would be heavy, much heavier than a normal stove. The platform was constructed from heavy logs laid on the cabin floor, creating a stable base that distributed weight across multiple floor joists. On this platform, he positioned the stove. Then he built a framework around the stove. He used saplings and willow branches, creating a cage that surrounded the stove on all sides, leaving about 8 inches of space between the framework and the stove body. The framework would hold the mud in place as it dried. Next came the mud mixture. Gunnar had spent weeks preparing materials. He dug clay from a riverbank, selecting clay with good plasticity that would hold together when dried. He'd gathered moss from shaded areas under spruce trees, using only the green, living moss that still had elasticity. He'd cut and dried grass, creating a fibrous material that would reinforce the clay. The mixture was approximately 60% clay, 20% moss, and 20% dried grass. He added water gradually, mixing thoroughly with his hands and feet, creating a thick, sticky mass that held together but wasn't soupy. The consistency was like bread dough, firm but workable. He began packing this mixture into the framework around the stove. He worked carefully, pressing the mud firmly against the previous layer, ensuring no air gaps existed. He built up the mud coating gradually, adding 2 to 3 inches per day, and allowing each layer to dry partially before adding the next. This slow process prevented cracking from too rapid drying. It took 2 weeks to complete the coating. The final thickness was 8 inches on all sides except the top, where it was 6 inches. The stovepipe protruded through a carefully formed opening in the mud. The loading door was accessible through a tunnel-like opening he'd formed in the mud. The entire assembly, stove and mud coating combined, probably weighed 500 to 600 pounds. The first visitor to see the completed stove was a trapper named Jack Morrison, an old sourdough who'd been in Alaska since the 1890s. He took one look at Gunnar's creation and burst out laughing. "What in the name of God is that? You wrapped your stove in mud? Why would you do that?" "To hold heat," Gunnar said simply. "The mud, it adds mass. The mass stores heat. The stove will stay warm for many hours after the fire goes out." Morrison shook his head, still chuckling. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen, and I've seen some crazy things in Alaska. That mud's going to crack and fall off the first time you fire that stove up. The heat will dry it out and it'll just crumble. And even if it doesn't fall off, what's the point? All you've done is make your stove heat slower. It's going to take forever to warm up with all that mud around it." Gunnar shrugged. "Maybe. We will see when winter comes." Morrison looked at the massive mud-coated stove again. "You know what everyone's going to call this, right? They're going to call it the stupidest stove in Alaska. And they're going to call you the fool who built it." "Let them call it what they want," Gunnar said. "If it works, I don't care what they call it." Word spread through the trapping community. The Norwegian had built a mud-packed stove, Trappers traveled out of their way to see it. The reactions ranged from amusement to disbelief to genuine concern that Gunnar had lost his mind. One trapper, a man named Robert Henderson, examined the stove carefully and voiced a different concern. "That mud's going to hold moisture. It'll rust out your stove from the outside in. You'll have a rusted-through stove by January. And then what? You'll freeze because you wrapped your stove in mud." Another trapper worried about fire safety. That much mass around a hot stove, if something goes wrong, if the mud cracks and falls on the fire, you could have a real problem. You've basically built a mud oven around your heat source. What if it collapses? A third trapper simply couldn't understand the logic. You spent 2 weeks packing mud around a stove. 2 weeks you could have spent cutting wood. And for what? To make your stove heat slower? That's backwards thinking. But Gunnar had done his calculations. He estimated the mud coating weighed approximately 400 pounds. Clay has a specific heat capacity of about 0.2 calories per gram per degree Celsius. 400 pounds of clay would store a significant amount of heat if brought to high temperature. How much heat, and would it release slowly enough to be useful? He was about to find out. The first fire was lit in late September. Gunnar loaded the firebox with dry spruce, started a small kindling fire, and gradually built it up. He monitored carefully, watching for cracks in the mud coating. The mud hissed slightly as residual moisture evaporated from the inner surface. A few small hairline cracks appeared, but nothing structural. He kept the fire moderate for the first few hours, allowing the mud to cure gradually in the heat. As the day progressed, he increased the fire intensity. By evening, he had a hot fire burning, and the stove body was radiating significant heat. The mud coating felt warm to the touch, but not hot. This was good. It meant the mud was absorbing heat without cracking from thermal stress. He maintained the fire through the evening, keeping it hot but not excessive. At 10 o'clock, he let the fire die down. By 11, the fire was out, just a bed of coals remaining. The test would now show whether his theory was correct. At midnight, Gunnar placed his hand on the mud surface. It was warm, distinctly warm. The stove body inside was still hot. The cabin temperature was 65 degrees Fahrenheit, comfortable. At 2 in the morning, he checked again. The mud was still warm. The cabin was 62 degrees. At 4 in the morning, warm mud, cabin temperature 60 degrees. At 6 in the morning, still warm, cabin temperature 58 degrees. Outside temperature was 18 degrees above zero, moderate for Alaska fall. The mud-packed stove had kept the cabin comfortable for 7 hours after the fire went out. A normal stove, cast iron or sheet metal, would have cooled the cabin to outside temperature within 2 hours. Gunnar had his proof. The system worked. But the real test would come in deep winter, when temperatures dropped far below zero and the killing cold tested every man and every shelter. That test arrived in January of 1913. A high-pressure system settled over interior Alaska, bringing clear skies and plummeting temperatures. The thermometer at Gunnar's cabin dropped day by day, 30 below, 40 below, 50 below. Then, on January 18th, it hit 62 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. This was extreme cold, dangerous cold, the kind of cold that could kill. Other trappers in the region went into survival mode. They burned wood constantly, stuffing their stoves to capacity every hour, trying to maintain cabin temperatures above freezing. Some failed. Cabins dropped to zero or below despite constant fires. The trappers huddled in every piece of clothing they owned, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but feed fires and try to survive. Jack Morrison later reported that he burned 3/4 of a cord of wood in 3 days during that cold snap. He estimated his cabin temperature never got above 35 degrees despite constant fire. He slept in his sleeping bag fully clothed, waking every hour to add wood. He described it as the most miserable 3 days of his life. Gunnar's experience was entirely different. He ran his usual heating routine. Each day at noon, he built a fire in his mud-packed stove, hot fire for 4 to 5 hours, really heating the stove body and the surrounding mud mass. By 5 in the afternoon, the fire was dying down. By 6, it was out. Then the waiting game began. At 62 below outside, the cabin would normally cool rapidly, but not with the mud-packed stove. At 7 in the evening, 2 hours after the fire went out, the cabin temperature was 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The mud coating was radiating heat steadily. At 10 in the evening, cabin temperature was 58 degrees. The stove was still warm to the touch. At midnight, cabin temperature was 55 degrees. At 3 in the morning, cabin temperature was 52 degrees. At 6 in the morning, cabin temperature was 50 degrees. At 9 in the morning, cabin temperature was 48 degrees. From 6 in the evening, when the fire went out, until 9 the next morning, 15 hours later, the cabin had only dropped 14 degrees. Outside temperature remained at 60 below or colder the entire time. The mud-packed stove had maintained a 110-degree temperature differential, keeping the cabin 110 degrees warmer than outside for 15 hours with no fire. Gunnar slept through the night, not dozing, not half-sleeping between wood additions, but actually sleeping. 8 solid hours. He woke, comfortable, in a cabin that was 50 degrees, cold but not dangerous, not even particularly uncomfortable with proper bedding. He built another fire at 9 in the morning, warming the cabin back up to 65 degrees and recharging the mud mass. Then he let that fire go out by early afternoon and repeated the cycle. During the 3-day cold snap, while his neighbors burned obscene amounts of wood and nearly froze anyway, Gunnar lived in relative comfort. He burned approximately 40 pounds of wood per day, total 120 pounds over 3 days. Jack Morrison burned 3/4 of a cord, roughly 600 pounds of wood. Gunnar used 1/5 the fuel and was 5 times more comfortable. When the cold snap broke and temperatures climbed back to a more normal -30, trappers visited Gunnar to see if he'd survived. They expected to find him low on wood, exhausted, possibly frostbitten. Instead, they found him well-rested, well-fed, and with plenty of wood left in his stack. Jack Morrison stood in Gunnar's cabin, feeling the warmth, looking at the still warm mud-coated stove, and finally understanding. "I mocked this thing," Morrison said quietly. "I called it stupid. I told everyone you were crazy." Gunnar nodded. "I remember. I was wrong. Dead wrong. This stove, this mud coating, it's brilliant. You outsmarted the cold. You outsmarted all of us." Morrison paused, then asked the question every trapper wanted answered. "How much wood did you burn during the cold snap?" "About 40 pounds a day," Gunnar said. 120 pounds total over 3 days. Morrison was stunned. "I burned 600 pounds in the same time. You used 1/5 what I used. And your cabin was warmer than mine." "How is that possible?" Gunnar explained. "The mud, it stores heat from the fire. 400 pounds of mud heated to maybe 300 degrees or more. That heat releases slowly over many hours. The mud acts like, how do you say, a battery. A battery for heat. It charges when the fire burns. It discharges slowly through the night. The stove body stays warm. The cabin stays warm. I sleep through the night. No feeding fire every hour." Morrison walked around the stove, examining the mud coating. It was intact, no major cracks, no fallen pieces. The surface was slightly cracked in a network pattern like dried mud always cracks, but structurally sound. Your mud didn't fall off. Henderson said it would rust out your stove. Has it? Gunnar shook his head. The mud is dry inside now, no moisture. The stove is fine, and the mud has hardened. Very hard, like pottery. It will last for years. Morrison placed his hand on the mud surface. It was still warm, almost hot, even though the fire had been out for hours. "This is going to change everything," Morrison said. "Everyone's going to want one of these." Word spread fast. The mud-packed stove that everyone had mocked had proven itself under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Trappers wanted to know details. How thick should the mud be? What mixture of clay, moss, and grass? How long to cure it? Could it be added to an existing stove? Gunnar became a teacher, explaining the principles and helping trappers modify their own stoves. Not everyone could replicate his exact design. Some trappers didn't have access to good clay. Some had stoves in locations where the floor couldn't support the extra weight, but most trappers could make some version of the mud packing work. One trapper, working with poor clay, added more grass fiber to his mixture, creating a lighter, more insulated coating that didn't have quite the thermal mass but still performed much better than a bare stove. Another trapper, worried about floor weight, built a thinner coating, only 4 inches thick instead of 8. It didn't store as much heat but still extended the burn time significantly. A third trapper built a mud coating around a sheet metal Yukon stove. The thin metal heated the mud faster than cast iron, but the mud mass compensated, storing heat and releasing it slowly. The result was almost as good as Gunnar's cast iron version. By the winter of 1913 to 1914, approximately 15 trappers in the region had some form of mud-packed stove. All reported significant improvements in comfort and reductions in fuel consumption. The technique spread beyond the immediate area. Trappers traveling to Fairbanks and other settlements told the story. The Norwegian with the mud-packed stove who outsmarted 62 below. The story was compelling, and the solution was accessible. Anyone with mud and a stove could try it. By 1915, mud-packed stoves were appearing throughout interior Alaska. The specific implementations varied. Some used pure clay, some used clay-moss mixtures, some added sand for structure. Some built thin coatings, some built thick coatings, some wrapped only the sides, some covered the top as well, but all were based on the same principle Gunnar had demonstrated. Add thermal mass to the stove to store heat and release it slowly. If you're fascinated by this ingenious solution to extreme cold and want to see more stories about how our ancestors outsmarted nature's harshest conditions with simple, elegant innovations, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There are so many more incredible survival techniques waiting to be discovered. The science behind Gunnar's mud-packed stove is straightforward thermal physics. Cast iron has a specific heat capacity of about 0.46 joules per gram per Celsius, or roughly 0.11 calories per gram per Celsius. Clay has a specific heat capacity of about 0.8 joules per gram per Celsius, or roughly 0.2 calories per gram per Celsius. So clay actually stores nearly twice as much heat per unit weight as cast iron. Gunnar's stove body probably weighed around 80 pounds. The mud coating weighed around 400 pounds. Together, that's 480 pounds of thermal mass. When heated to an average temperature of, say, 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and then allowed to cool to 50 degrees, a 200-degree drop, the cast iron stove would release approximately 7,000 BTUs. The mud coating would release approximately 32,000 BTUs, combined nearly 40,000 BTUs of stored heat. For comparison, a cabin at 62 below might lose heat at a rate of 6,000 to 8,000 BTUs per hour, depending on insulation. Gunnar's mud-packed stove could potentially provide 5 to 6 hours of heat from stored thermal mass alone. In practice, the cabin stayed comfortable for much longer because the heat release was so gradual. The heat didn't all release at once. The outer layer of mud cooled first, releasing heat to the cabin air. But this cooling was slowed by the inner layers of mud, which were still hot. The inner layers released their heat into the outer layers, keeping them warm. The innermost mud, right against the hot stove body, stayed hot the longest, sometimes remaining above 150 degrees for 8 to 10 hours. This gradual cascading heat release meant the cabin received steady, sustained warmth for many hours. The mud also insulated the stove body itself, keeping it hotter for longer. A bare, cast iron stove radiates heat quickly and cools quickly. Surrounded by mud, the stove body cooled much more slowly. Its heat had to conduct through 8 inches of mud before reaching the cabin air. This slow conduction meant the stove stayed effective for much longer. The comparison to a masonry heater is instructive. European masonry heaters, also called kachelofen or tile stoves, work on exactly this principle. A fire heats a large mass of brick, tile, or stone. The fire burns hot and fast for a few hours. Then the fire goes out, and the stored heat releases slowly through the day and night. Some masonry heaters stay warm for 24 hours or more. Gunnar's mud-packed stove was a frontier adaptation of this proven technology. He couldn't build a proper masonry heater, but he could achieve similar results with materials at hand. The beauty of his solution was its simplicity and accessibility. No special materials required, no specialized skills required. Just mud, moss, grass, and patience. Any trapper could build one. The curing process was important. Gunnar had learned from his first firing that gradual heat application prevented cracking. Other trappers who tried to heat their newly packed stoves too quickly sometimes experienced severe cracking or even spalling where chunks of mud fell off. The trick was to start with small fires and gradually increase intensity over several days, allowing the moisture to leave the mud slowly and allowing the mud to harden in stages. Properly cured, the mud coating became extremely hard, almost ceramic-like. It could withstand repeated heating and cooling cycles without degradation. The maintenance requirements were minimal. Once or twice per winter, Gunnar would check the mud coating for cracks. Small hairline cracks were normal and didn't affect performance. Larger cracks could be filled with fresh mud mixture pressed into the gap. The repair dried and hardened, becoming part of the coating. Over years of use, the mud coating remained functional with only minor touch-ups. One concern some trappers had was fire safety. If the mud coating cracked and fell off while the stove was hot, could it cause a fire? In practice, this wasn't a problem. The mud was largely clay, which is non-combustible. Even if a piece fell off, it would just lie on the floor cooling. It couldn't ignite anything. And properly applied mud, cured correctly, rarely fell off anyway. Another concern was accessibility. With 8 inches of mud surrounding the stove, how did you clean it? How did you maintain it? Gunnar's design addressed this. The loading door had a tunnel through the mud that allowed full access. The ash cleanout was similarly accessible. The mud coating didn't interfere with normal stove operation. It just surrounded the stove, storing heat. The weight issue was real but manageable. 500 pounds is substantial, but distributed across a platform that spanned multiple floor joists, the weight was supportable. Some trappers with weaker cabin floors built shorter mud coatings or used lighter mud mixtures. The performance wasn't quite as good, but it was still a major improvement over a bare stove. The aesthetic issue was perhaps the most divisive. Some trappers thought the mud-coated stoves were ugly. They looked like primitive clay mounds in the middle of the cabin, but most trappers quickly decided that comfort mattered more than appearance. Who cared if the stove was ugly if it kept you warm? Some trappers tried to make their mud coatings more attractive. They smoothed the surface carefully, creating clean lines. Some carved designs into the wet mud before it hardened. One creative trapper embedded small stones in his mud coating in a decorative pattern. These efforts showed that even practical, functional designs could have aesthetic considerations. But the primary purpose was always heat retention, not beauty. The fuel savings were the most compelling benefit. Gunnar estimated he used approximately 30 to 35% of the firewood his neighbors used during an average winter. Over a 6-month heating season, this was the difference between burning 12 cords of wood versus 35 to 40 cords. The labor savings were enormous. Cutting, hauling, splitting, and stacking 12 cords of wood was perhaps 40 to 50 days of work. Cutting 40 cords was 120 to 150 days of work. Gunnar saved 2 to 3 months of brutal physical labor every winter. This time could be spent on more productive activities. More time checking trap lines meant more furs. More time hunting meant more food. More time resting meant better health and alertness. The economic calculations were compelling. Trappers were in Alaska to make money from furs. Time spent cutting wood was time not spent trapping. If you could cut your wood requirements by 2/3, you could increase your trapping time by corresponding amounts, potentially increasing fur harvests and income. The health impacts were also significant. The constant exposure to extreme cold, the exhaustion from endless wood cutting, the sleep deprivation from hourly fire tending, all of these factors wore down trappers' health. Frostbite, exhaustion, injuries from accidents while exhausted, respiratory problems from breathing extreme cold air, these were constant dangers. Anything that reduced these risks improved survival chances. Gunnar's mud-packed stove didn't eliminate the dangers of Alaska trapping, but it significantly reduced one major category of risk. By the late 1910s, mud-packed stoves had become relatively common in interior Alaska trapping camps. They weren't universal. Some old-timers stuck with their traditional methods, too stubborn or too skeptical to try something new. Some areas lacked suitable clay for mud packing. Some trappers simply couldn't be bothered with the 2-week process of building the coating. But among those who did adopt the technique, the feedback was universally positive. It worked. It saved fuel. It saved labor. It saved lives. One trapper, writing in a 1919 letter preserved in Alaska Historical Archives, described his mud-packed stove as the single most important improvement he'd made in 15 years of trapping. He wrote that the stove had quite possibly saved his life during the severe winter of 1917 to 1918, when a midwinter cold snap caught him low on wood. His mud-packed stove allowed him to stretch his remaining wood for an extra week until he could safely cut more. A traditional stove would have burned through his wood in 3 days, potentially leaving him without heat in dangerous cold. Another trapper, interviewed in 1925 for a local newspaper, credited his mud-packed stove with allowing him to continue trapping into his 60s. He explained that he no longer had the strength to cut and haul 30 cords of wood per winter, but he could manage 10 to 12 cords. The mud-packed stove made it possible for him to keep trapping despite his advancing age. These testimonials, while anecdotal, suggest that Gunnar's innovation had real, meaningful impact on people's lives. It wasn't just a curious novelty. It was a practical solution to a life-threatening problem. Gunnar himself continued trapping until 1928, when at age 64 he finally decided Alaska winters were for younger men. He moved to Fairbanks, bought a small house, and lived comfortably on his savings and a small pension from his gold rush days. He died in 1941 at age 77, having lived a long life by Alaska standards. His mud-packed stove remained in use at his trapline cabin for years after he left. Other trappers who used the cabin maintained the mud coating, recognizing its value. The cabin itself was eventually abandoned in the 1950s when that particular trapline became uneconomical and the structure gradually deteriorated. But the principle Gunnar had demonstrated lived on. Before we explore the lasting legacy of this innovation, if you've been captivated by this story of survival ingenuity in the most extreme conditions and want to hear more forgotten techniques that solved impossible problems, take a second to hit that subscribe button. The best stories of frontier innovation are still ahead. In the modern era, interest in Gunnar's technique has revived among certain groups. Off-grid enthusiasts living in cold climates have experimented with thermal mass stove wraps. Some use traditional mud and clay, others use modern materials like cob, a mixture of clay, sand, and straw. Others use refractory cement or ceramic fiber. The principle remains the same. Wrap the stove in mass, store heat, release slowly. Some modern implementations achieve even better performance than Gunnar's original. Using insulated mass with an insulating outer layer that reduces heat loss can extend the burn time even further. Some designs incorporate heat-absorbing cores made from dense materials surrounded by insulating layers, creating a thermal battery that charges quickly but discharges very slowly. These modern refinements prove that Gunnar's basic insight was sound and that there's still room for optimization. The rocket mass heater, a popular alternative heating system in natural building circles, is based on similar principles. A super-hot fire heats a large thermal mass, typically a masonry bench or cob-covered barrel, which then radiates heat for hours. The similarity to Gunnar's mud-packed stove is obvious. Both use thermal mass to store heat from a fire and release it slowly. Gunnar's version was simpler and more accessible, requiring no specialized construction skills, but the physics are identical. The revival of interest in these low-tech heating solutions is driven by several factors. Rising energy costs make fuel efficiency important again. Environmental concerns about wood smoke and carbon emissions incentivize burning less wood. Off-grid living requires solutions that don't depend on electricity or complex infrastructure. And there's a growing appreciation for traditional knowledge and historical techniques. Gunnar's mud-packed stove fits all these needs. It's fuel-efficient, reducing wood consumption by 2/3. It reduces emissions by burning less wood overall. It requires no electricity or complex parts, and it represents valuable traditional knowledge that nearly disappeared. The challenge in modern applications is adapting the technique to different contexts. Gunnar was working with a small log cabin in extreme cold. Modern applications might involve larger spaces, different construction types, different climate conditions. The basic principle scales, but the specific implementation must be adapted. Some modern experimenters have built mud-wrapped wood stoves in conventional houses, creating a focal heating point that can warm a living space with minimal fuel. Others have used the technique in workshops, greenhouses, or other auxiliary buildings where supplemental heat is needed but full heating systems aren't justified. The aesthetic challenge remains. A mud-coated stove in a modern living room looks out of place. Some builders address this by plastering over the mud with finish plaster, creating a smooth surface that can be painted or left natural. Others embrace the rustic appearance, treating the mud-wrapped stove as a conversation piece and connection to historical practices. A few ambitious builders have created elaborate sculpted designs, forming the mud into artistic shapes or embedded decorative elements. The practical benefits remain regardless of appearance. The fuel savings, the extended burn times, the even heat distribution. All of these advantages are just as relevant now as they were in 1913 Alaska. The specific percentage savings depend on the starting point. A modern, efficient wood stove wrapped in mud might see 20 to 30% fuel savings. An older, less efficient stove might see 50 to 60% savings. The technique works across a range of applications. The story of Gunnar and his mud-packed stove embodies several important themes. First, innovation often comes from combining traditional knowledge with practical problem-solving. Gunnar knew about masonry heaters from Europe. He adapted that knowledge to Alaska conditions using available materials. This kind of adaptive innovation is valuable in any context. Second, mockery and skepticism often greet new ideas, especially ideas that seem to contradict conventional wisdom. Gunnar endured significant ridicule but trusted his understanding of thermal physics. His vindication proved that evidence and results matter more than popular opinion. Third, simple solutions are often the best solutions. Gunnar's mud-packed stove required no special materials, no advanced technology, no rare skills, just mud, patience, and understanding of basic principles, yet it outperformed more complex approaches. Fourth, small improvements can have large impacts. The mud-packed stove didn't revolutionize Alaska trapping. It didn't change the fundamental nature of the work, but it made that work significantly more survivable and sustainable. It saved fuel, saved labor, saved lives. That's meaningful impact from a simple modification. Fifth, knowledge preservation matters. Gunnar's technique nearly disappeared from history, If not for a few written accounts and oral histories, it would have been completely forgotten. We should actively preserve traditional knowledge before it's lost. The practical lessons for modern applications are clear. If you heat with wood in a cold climate, adding thermal mass to your stove will reduce fuel consumption and extend burn times. The specific implementation can vary based on your stove type, space constraints, and available materials, but the principle is universal. Mass stores heat. Heat releases slowly. Less fuel needed. For survivalists and emergency preparedness enthusiasts, the mud-packed stove represents an important option. In a scenario where fuel is limited or supply chains are disrupted, the ability to heat efficiently becomes critical. Knowing how to build a thermal mass wrap for a stove could be life-saving knowledge. For students of history and technology, Gunnar's story illustrates how frontier people solved complex problems with limited resources. The Alaska trappers of the early 1900s faced challenges that would defeat most modern people. They succeeded through ingenuity, adaptability, and willingness to learn from mistakes. These qualities are timeless. The comparison between Gunnar's winter and Jack Morrison's winter during the 62 below cold snap tells the whole story. Gunnar slept comfortably, burned 120 pounds of wood over 3 days, and maintained his cabin at 50 to 60 degrees. Morrison barely slept, burned 600 pounds of wood, and kept his cabin at 35 degrees or less. Same cold, same conditions, wildly different outcomes. The difference was knowledge and application of thermal mass principles. The mud-packed stove that everyone called stupid kept Gunnar comfortable at 62 below. It allowed him to sleep through the night while others stayed awake feeding fires. It used 1/5 the fuel his neighbors used. It proved that understanding physics beats following tradition. The mockery Gunnar endured was based on assumptions, not evidence. His critics assumed mud would crack and fall off. It didn't. They assumed it would slow heating and reduce performance. It didn't. They assumed it would cause problems. It didn't. They were wrong about everything because they were judging based on gut feelings rather than understanding. Gunnar understood thermal mass, heat capacity, and gradual heat release. His critics understood burning wood in a stove is how you stay warm and thought that was all there was to know. The knowledge gap created a massive performance gap. This pattern repeats throughout history. Experts with deep understanding develop solutions that seem wrong to people with surface knowledge. The surface knowledge people mock the solutions. Then the solutions work, and the mockery looks foolish in retrospect. Gunnar's mud-packed stove went through this exact cycle, mocked as stupid, proven brilliant, eventually adopted widely. The stupid mud-packed stove wasn't stupid. It was the product of clear thinking applied to a real problem. It was adaptation of proven principles to new contexts. It was innovation that valued results over appearances. And it outsmarted 62 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, which is the only measure that mattered. Everyone said it was stupid, until it kept Gunnar warm at 62 below while they froze, until it burned 1/5 the fuel they burned, until it let him sleep while they stayed awake feeding fires. Then they stopped calling it stupid. Then they started calling it brilliant. Then they started building their own. That's how innovation spreads, not through argument or persuasion, but through undeniable results. Gunnar had results. His cabin was warm. His woodpile lasted. He survived and thrived while others merely survived. The evidence was overwhelming. The mud-packed stove worked. Everything else was just opinion. The story of Gunnar Olafsen and his mud-packed stove is ultimately about the power of applied knowledge, the courage to ignore mockery, and the value of thinking differently. It's about a Norwegian trapper who saw a problem, understood the physics needed to solve it, and built a solution despite ridicule. The solution worked. It saved fuel. It saved labor. It quite possibly saved lives, and it proved that sometimes the person everyone calls stupid is the only one actually thinking clearly. The mud-packed stove outsmarted 62 below. It outsmarted conventional wisdom. It outsmarted the skeptics and the mockers, not through luck or accident, but through sound application of thermal physics using simple, available materials. Gunnar Olafsen, building his mud coating in the fall of 1912, created something that outperformed every conventional solution. He did it with mud, moss, and grass, materials that cost nothing, methods anyone could replicate, and principles that are as true now as they were then. Mass stores heat. Heat releases slowly. Understanding this simple truth made the difference between comfort and misery, between sleeping and exhausting yourself, between efficiency and waste. The stupid mud-packed stove, everyone mocked it, until it worked. Then nobody was laughing. They were building their own, and staying warm, just like Gunnar.